Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to explore the spiritual implications of the near-death experience. With me is Barbara Harris Whitfield, who is a near-death researcher and experiencer. She is the first woman to serve on the board of directors of the International Association for Near-Death Studies. She is the author of about a dozen books, including The Natural Soul and Spiritual Awakenings, and co-author with her husband, Dr. Charles Whitfield, of The Power of Humility. In addition, she is a respirational therapist and a psychotherapist. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Your experience, your near-death experience, was extraordinarily powerful for you, even though it occurred 40 years ago. It's as if your whole life has been, to a large degree, shaped by it.
Yes, to this very day, it rules my life.
That's quite extraordinary.
Yeah. I was an atheist before the experience. I didn't believe in anything.
And that feeling of transformation, having been transformed by a powerful experience, is common to near-death experiences.
Absolutely. If we weren't spiritual before, it's going to really change our life. And a lot of us in the support groups talk about it's comparable to being hit over the head with a 2x4. In the beginning, it's very, very hard because we don't understand that shift we're going through.
Well, as you say, you were an atheist, you weren't engaged in spiritual practices, and all of a sudden there you are confronted with what is taken to be a very powerful spiritual reality.
Right. See, before that happened as a child, I had gone through a really difficult childhood, and I think I stopped believing in everything when I was about 8 or 9. And then here I was, 32 years old, and all of a sudden I felt like I was being embraced by a God. It's hard to say, because God to me has so many different dimensions, you know, but I was embraced by something much, much more powerful than this reality. And
I've had powerful experiences of my own that have led me to be where I am now, interviewing you, but not a near-death experience. So let's hear more about the story. I know there are many patterns that seem to be common to near-death experiences.
Yes, and mine started off with being out in the hallway in the middle of the night, not knowing.
You were in the hospital.
I was in the hospital. I had had 5.5 hours of surgery on my spine. I woke up in a striker frame circle bed, which is a really strange way to wake up.
You're sort of suspended in midair.
I'm suspended, and I can't move. The bed would move me 3 times a day to put me on my belly so that they would air out my back and drain my lungs. And somewhere around the 3rd night, sleeping, all of a sudden I'm out in the hallway. And I looked up and down the hall, and I thought, if they catch me out here, I'm going to get into trouble. I better get back in the bed. And I moved back into the room and looked down, and there was my body in the circle bed, sleeping. And that was fine. I was so peaceful and out of pain that I was really quite pleased to be up there looking down at her. And then the next thing I knew, I was floating through this darkness. And the first thing that caught my attention was that the boundaries, whatever they were totally black, but then there was energy churning through the blackness, and shades of gray were coming out. And then the shades of gray would get lighter and become almost bright light and move down to form the light. But I didn't look at that moment. I was so fascinated by what was going on and thinking, there's light in the darkness. That was the first thing that hit me. And there still is. Every day when we get into darkness, we can find light if we look. And the next thing I knew, I was being embraced by my grandmother, who had been dead for 14 years. And I had never once thought of her existing beyond her death. And there we were together, and she was holding me the way she would when I was a child. And we re-experienced all 19 years we were together, every memory. But I wasn't just experiencing the memories through myself, I was experiencing them through her. I could see through her eyes, I could feel through her heart. I suddenly realized how important I was to her. I'd never thought about it before. And then as this continued and then finished when I was 19 and she died, I started moving away from her. But heart to heart, there were no words, heart to heart, she let me know that she would always be there waiting for me when I came back.
How much time had elapsed, do you think?
You know, I'm not sure, but
Since
to me
you
it was
lived 19 years.
It was 19 years as far as experiencing it went. But then I was back in my body and it was morning, so it couldn't have been more than a couple hours. But it doesn't translate here, you know. And then a week later, it happened again. And that time when I lifted out of my body, I had been put on my belly on this very uncomfortable bed, and I only weighed 85 pounds at that point. I had lost 30 pounds or 35 pounds. So it was very uncomfortable. And the door was closed, and I didn't have the button to call the nurse. So I started calling, and then I started screaming, and then I became hysterical. And years later in the research, we did validate the fact that it's called the trauma transcendence interface. This was not a near-death experience. This was a trauma transcendence interface where the trauma led me to transcend.
So you could call it like an out-of-body experience.
It started off out of body, but I looked out into the darkness again and saw myself at about a year old in a crib, face down, crying. And then I looked down and I saw myself in the circle bed crying just as hard. And I looked back and forth about 3 times, and then I thought, I don't want to be her anymore. And a lot of near-death experiencers talk about this. It's the moment that we let go of this lifetime. That's what helps us to move into the experience. And as I let her go, I felt this amazing, incredible, indescribable energy wrap itself around me and hold me. And together we went to the baby in the bubble, but then the bubble turned into a cloud of bubbles. And there was another event in each bubble of my life.
Each of those bubbles was an event from your life.
And together we moved, and
together with some
unexplainable, amazingly beautiful, what we try to believe or we try to imagine as a God force. But I experienced it. It was me, and I was it.
40 years ago, you had this experience. It was so powerful that you remember it today, and it has shaped your whole life.
As I talk about it, I'm back there again. And what was so amazing in this was, as I saw my difficult childhood, as I was going from bubble to bubble, and I was thinking, no wonder. For the first time, I had an understanding that no wonder I am the way I am now. Look what was done to me as a child. And as I was saying my no wonders, this energy was holding me even tighter, because I think I would have exploded out into the universe if I hadn't have been held like this. And just like with my grandmother, I could see it through God's eyes, not just mine, and I could feel it through God's heart.
Every experience of your life, would you say, or just highlights?
No, all 32 years. I
all
relived
32 years. And I assume, again, it was a matter of minutes or hours.
I went back later on. I was a volunteer at the hospital before I became a respiratory therapist. I went back and I looked at some of my records. I couldn't get them all. But it was probably about 20 minutes that I was out. 20 minutes was 32 years. Nothing translates from this reality to that reality. That reality is always there, here, where we are now.
It's like a reality outside of time as we experience
it.
Right,
it's eternity, and eternity doesn't move in a linear fashion. Eternity just is. So I was just is with God for 20 minutes, and then or 32 years. And then I came back here, and of course I couldn't be an atheist anymore.
But let me ask you now, you had let go in your mind of your present life. What caused you to return?
I was back.
You just,
I
there
had
you were.
no control.
It's not as if you were given a choice or made a decision.
No, a lot of people are given a choice. And a lot of them choose to stay, and they're sent back anyway. And then they have to deal with that. The guilt of, I didn't want to come back to my loved ones. This is a big problem for early near-death experiencers. I didn't want to come back, and yet I did. And how can I tell them?
Well, one of the real issues for this experience, it seems so lofty, so close to God, so spiritual, and yet people come back and they have to integrate that into a life that may be full of human problems. And in your case, you described an abusive childhood. So you had a lot of issues to work through in order to understand and incorporate the spiritual aspects of your experience.
Right, and the first issue was, for me, my mother had been a drug addict. She was addicted to prescription drugs. She was doing what the doctors told her, but she was a heavy addict. And then in the full body cast for 7 months, I'm taking all these drugs they're giving me. You know, they're giving me opiates, they're giving me Valium, they're giving me sleeping pills. And I think a lot of it was that it was hard for my doctors to look at me and not feel sorry for me and keep giving me prescriptions to supposedly keep me happy. But those drugs weren't doing anything but making me numb.
And it seems as if that's what the medical community knows what to do.
Right. So I just made up my mind. First I went to see a psychiatrist because I wanted to know what had happened, and I figured he would know. And this was the year that Raymond Moody's book came out, but nobody had read it yet.
That would be
1975.
Life After Life.
Yes, yes. So the psychiatrist didn't know, and what he said to me was, you have to go home and heal. It's going to take 7 months. And then you have to go through about a year of physical therapy. And then what you really want to do is go into psychoanalysis. So if you ever get strong enough again, because they had their doubts about me and what was going on, you come back and I'll see you 4 mornings a week. And he wrote me a prescription for antidepressants. So I came home with the prescription and I put it on the counter and I saw all the pills and all I could see was my mother. That this was my mother's life. I have 3 young children. The life review showed me towards the end that I was becoming like my mother. So that was my first issue when I came back. I will not put my children through the same childhood I went through. And I just threw away all the pills. You know, I went cold turkey. And it was the best thing I ever did. This was the beginning of my new life.
Now, I know that going cold turkey is not for everybody. Many people are prescribed medicines that are not good for them, and they might listen to an interview like this and say, I should just go cold turkey.
No, you can't go cold turkey. What was amazing for me, because this is the kind of work my husband and I do now, is we help people get off of opiates and benzodiazepines. I think it was because I had had that near-death experience. I was given such an injection of energy, spiritual energy, that I was able to go off all of those pills. And it was okay, but I would never recommend it for anybody else to do. Thank you for pointing that out.
I'm glad we're clear about that. But now let's return to the spiritual implications, because for you it was like instantaneous conversion from atheist to somebody who had been embraced by what you understood to be God.
Correct. So when I did go through the physical therapy and I got strong enough again, I volunteered at the hospital where I had been. I was in the emergency room. They knew already, the staff knew if anybody was dying to call me and I would sit with them. This became very important for me, to be with people that were dying, to help them transition. And for me personally, it wasn't just to help them. For me, it was being with the honesty of people who are dying. They, you know, at the end, they just want somebody to be with them and understand what's going on with them. And that became first 1 day a week. By the time I was doing it 3 days a week as a volunteer, I realized I needed to go back to school. And that's when I became an RT, a respiratory therapist. And at this point, I was working in Miami Beach at Mount Sinai Medical Center during the Mariel boat landing.
Oh, yes.
And we had a lot of people coming off those boats that would then die in our emergency
Cuban
room.
refugees.
Speaking only Spanish, and at that point the staff only spoke English. And I was holding hands with people that were talking to me that I didn't understand.
And they were dying.
And they would die. And they didn't understand me. And I knew that if I didn't stop doing that, I was going to get fired, because I was protesting all the time that we didn't have any Spanish-speaking nursing there. So I started doing home care for the dying, and that was magical. You know, dying does not have to be the way we've treated it here in America. Dying can be a celebration if the person is ready to go.
We all are going to die.
Right. It's part of life.
And in your case, it seems as if you feel like you've already died a couple of times.
Yeah, I have. And it's not the Grim Reaper. It is totally different. It is us. It is the energy. Yes, our body dies. Even our ego dies. But our true essence, what my husband calls the child within, what I call the soul, transcends this reality and goes to the next reality.
Well, that seems like such a profound lesson. It's hard to take it in. The words are simple enough, but the essence of what you're saying is elusive.
Elusive, but the real reality of, to me, why we're here.
Yeah.
We're here to keep stripping our ego and getting more and more real. If we can get rid of all those learned ways that we've handled life and become the essence of who we really are love. And love happens to be the verb of God. So our relationships with each other are really God in action. And that's why we wrote The Power of Humility, to show a map of how to live our life every day as love, not ego.
Well, I am looking forward to interviewing you in more depth about that whole process. And I know you've worked it out in great detail. But coming back to your work with near-death experiencers, you did research yourself. You looked at the after effects of the near-death experience.
That came a few years later. What happened was I met Kenneth and Ken interviewed me for Heading Toward Omega.
Which is one of the major books ever written on the near-death experience.
And I'm one of the key subjects in that book. And when he was interviewing me, I had no idea what the thesis was of that book. But when I came back to Florida after being at the University of Connecticut, he told me to start an IANS support group.
IANS being the International Association for Near-Death Studies.
Yeah, and so I put an ad in a few newspapers, and then the local TV channel interviewed me. And first meeting, we had 40 people. And everybody was just so excited and crying that we had finally met each other, others that had gone through
because especially in that era, people must have felt very lonely.
It was hard. It was hard coming back from being interviewed by him because he understood it so well. Anyway, one thing led to another. My husband and I, my first husband and I were getting a divorce. This was 9 years after my experience. Our marriage couldn't sustain my changes.
Well, and as I recall, your first husband was sort of invalidating your experience.
Everything. He didn't believe I had the experience. He said he believed that I thought I had the experience, but I didn't. So anyway, we're getting a divorce, and I was going to move up to Connecticut because I was the treasurer at that point of IANS. So I was going to work as an RT, and I was going to try to raise money for IANS. And Bruce Greyson, who was at the University of Michigan, was offered a job at the University of Connecticut Medical School that included a research assistant. So I was able to apply and get that job and spent 6 years interviewing people, running support groups, and working on the stats of he had a research pool of 500. I was just immersed for 6 years in the changes that happen after a near-death experience, and it was wonderful. And also, these two fellows did not want to go out and do the talking, so I went out. I was doing the TV shows. I was doing from churches to nursing conferences, and what I was hearing from a lot of other people was that they had been abused as children too, and they were having spiritual experiences.
Well, this is an extraordinary finding. And my understanding is that childhood abuse is very common amongst people who report lots of psychic experiences, is very common amongst people who have almost every type of mental illness, and common amongst the near-death experiencers.
Right. Child abuse, childhood trauma, doesn't have to be abuse. It can be some kind of trauma. You know, you lose a lot of loved ones, they die. You've got a family member who's mentally ill. There's a whole list. And what happens as adults, and Ken calls it a compensatory gift, is that when we were kids and it became so painful, that trauma transcendence interface I mentioned, it becomes so painful that we dissociate. We leave this reality and we go to a reality where it's peaceful.
In other words, it doesn't matter that you're being subjected to trauma because you have an escape.
Yeah, the classic experiences of somebody who's being raped as a child.
Mm-hmm.
The next thing they know, they're up at the ceiling, they're bored with looking at what's going on, and they look somewhere else and go into an alternate reality that Ken calls the imaginal realm.
Mm-hmm.
So as an adult, we're able to do this, and it's a gift that psychiatry doesn't want to be a gift. Psychiatry labels it as pathological. But
well, there's another aspect to this as well, the term imaginal realm. I like the term, but some people might be deceived into thinking that we're talking about imagination.
Right.
It seems to me that the imaginal realm has many properties in common for person to person to person that suggests, and I think your experience suggested to you, this is a real place.
Oh, more than real, ultra real.
Ultra real place, yeah.
Yes, yes, and it's okay if we come back here and it's not monopolizing our life.
Yeah.
If we can't hold a job, if we're not caring for our family, our children, then it's pathological. But it can also be a gift if you're a writer or any kind of an artist. This is creativity. This is the flow state.
Well, I know that some people who have the near-death experience have been living a life where they're not really prepared to all of a sudden change and be a spiritual person. And now they've had this profound spiritual experience, but they're back in their old life pattern where there may be all sorts of dishonest games going on. It's very hard for those people to adjust.
Right. That was why I went into helping people die, because there was honesty. And then I went on to teach volunteers of hospice. They're all real people.
Yeah.
You know, I had to seek out places that would fulfill me because I couldn't bring this home. And I totally understand when other people are having a hard time with it. Yeah. That's what our support groups were about for a long time. They're called Friends of IANS, and they're all over this country and in Europe.
And I understand that really it's taken you decades to integrate the profound spiritual awakening that occurred.
Yeah. Let me tell you what happened, okay? This is how it worked for me. To me, this world right now is just guided by God if we're ready to listen. So I'm working at the University of Connecticut. I'm asking Ken and Bruce to look at the child abuse factor or the trauma, the child trauma. And finally Ken put folded it into a questionnaire. And we came up with these really, really profound stats. And we called it unpredictable violence in childhood. Anyway, so now I'm ready to, let's look into it. You know, let's see how we're going to help these people. And they weren't ready to do something like that. That was a total change of the research we were doing. And all of a sudden, Charlie came into my life.
Your husband.
Yes, yes. And I had just prayed for a relationship. I was ready.
Yes.
And a few days later, he called me because he saw me on Larry King and knew he was coming up to Connecticut the next weekend. And I thought, well, before I have dinner with this man, I better look at his book. He had sent me a copy of Healing the Child Within. It was everything that I wanted to look at with Ken and Bruce. So here is the next stage of my life flowing into everything I was looking for Charlie had already done or was doing.
And you and your husband have developed programs of psychotherapy for people that touch both the most painful, cruel, abusive experiences of childhood and at the same time connect them up to some of the most sublime spiritual experiences of unity with the divine.
Well, this is how it works. If I hadn't been abused as a child, I wouldn't be doing the work I'm doing today. I'm helping people.
Yeah.
So my abuse took me to a path where I had to heal, which took just as long, 40 years too, to heal, to where I'm working now in the field and helping other people. I'm touching so many souls. So we make meaning. When it gets to that stage where, first of all, we're working on our abuse, the next stage is making meaning.
Making meaning. That's a very interesting concept.
Right, because we needed, unfortunately, what that meant to us to become who we are now.
Well, you chose to do that.
Yes.
And I suppose to some extent, like your divorce, it wasn't even a choice. It's something that
I was pushed into it. It was like a tube of toothpaste, you know. I had to get out of there because when you're changing that rapidly, there's no room to pull back. And I'll tell you who helped me the most at the point before I met Bruce and Ken and Charlie was William Campbell. I can't remember his first name now.
You mean Joseph Campbell?
Joseph Campbell.
Joseph Campbell, the mythologist.
I got his 6 tapes. Back when there were VHS tapes of the power.
The Bill Moyers interview series with Joseph Campbell.
Watched it over and over and over. And soon my 2 boys moved in with me. They left Florida and they came up to Connecticut. And we would watch them all the time because the boys understood too that this was our journey. We had taken the hero's journey. We had taken the choice of becoming our own hero in our own lives. So Joseph Campbell really helped me a lot.
I had the privilege of interviewing Joseph Campbell.
Really?
And I remember vividly, I asked him, if you could leave our audience with one thought, what would it be? And he said, follow your passion. And I can see that that's what you did. That's what your near-death experience prompted you. After that experience, you probably had little choice but to follow your passion.
Yes. See, that life review was such a gift because it showed me that I wasn't sick, bad, crazy, or stupid. I was wounded. And we can heal from our wounds if we believe we can heal. So that was such a gift, and also obviously being held by this energy that loved me so much that I could start to love myself. And then Joseph Campbell.
Barbara Harris Whitfield, thank you so much for sharing this half hour with me.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us.